I didn't know how heavy a word could be until I kept it inside. It was there the whole time, behind my teeth, pressing against the soft part of my mouth like something alive that wanted out. Not a speech, not a confession, just a single sentence, plain enough to be ignored, sharp enough to cut. I kept turning it over in my mind the way you turn a coin between your fingers, feeling both sides, pretending the metal isn't warming from your skin. There are moments when your body reacts before your thoughts catch up. My throat tightened long before I decided anything. My hands found reasons to stay busy. I adjusted what didn't need adjusting. I stared at nothing and listened too closely to everything. The air had that stale, used feeling, like it had already been breathed by men who were waiting for something to happen. I remember the silence between sounds more clearly than the sounds themselves. The pause after a door closed, the space after a boot step, the breath someone took before speaking, and the way everyone else held theirs until it was over. In those small gaps, my sentence kept rising, like it could float up on its own if I stopped pushing it down. It would have been easy to say it badly, to let it come out sideways as a complaint or a nervous joke, to put it in someone else's hands and act like it wasn't mine anymore. That was one of the lies I tried first, that if I spoke I could make it sound harmless, that it could slip past unnoticed and still do its work. But even in my own head it never sounded harmless. It sounded like a challenge, like doubt, like disrespect dressed up as concern. And the strange thing was, I didn't even need certainty to speak. I didn't need proof. I didn't need a perfect argument. I only needed the courage to accept what might happen next if I opened my mouth. Because the risk wasn't only in being wrong, the risk was in being right in front of the wrong people. I watched the faces around me for signs, some flicker of unease, some hesitation I could borrow. I wanted someone else to go first. I wanted the room itself to admit what I felt. But faces can be trained into stillness. Eyes can learn where not to look. And when everyone is pretending not to notice the same thing, it becomes easier to believe you're the only one who sees it. The sentence kept changing shape. Sometimes it came to me as a warning, sometimes as a question, sometimes as a simple, quiet, "Are we sure?" And each version sounded more pathetic than the last. A small voice trying to interrupt a machine already in motion. I pictured the way it would land, how it would hang there for a second, unwanted, and then drop to the floor like something spilled. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself there were others who knew more, who understood better, who had already considered what I was thinking and dismissed it for reasons I couldn't see. I told myself that my fear was not the same as insight, that anxiety can imitate wisdom if you listen too closely to it. But underneath all of that was the simpler truth I didn't want to name. I was afraid of being seen, not seen as brave, seen as difficult, seen as disloyal, seen as the kind of person who slows things down. In certain rooms, in certain times, hesitation is treated like an infection. One man hesitates and suddenly everyone is forced to remember they have choices. And choices are dangerous. They make people responsible. I could feel my heartbeat in my jaw. I could feel it in my fingertips when I tried to steady them. My mouth went dry in the way it does before you're sick. I swallowed and it didn't help. My tongue stuck to itself. Even breathing felt too loud. There was a moment, a clean, bright moment when the sentence was perfectly formed. It sat behind my lips like it belonged there. I could have said it then. I could have let it out in a calm voice, without drama, without pleading. I could have made it sound like routine, like caution, like the kind of thing that gets noted and addressed and filed away. Instead, I listened for someone else to speak. I listened so hard that I stopped hearing my own thoughts. I let the room fill up with other things, movements, murmurs, the faint scrape of something dragged across a surface. I waited for an opening that would not require me to force my way in. I waited for permission I knew would never be given. And when the moment passed, it didn't pass like time. It passed like a door closing. I felt it. That is what I remember most. The physical sensation of the chance leaving. My shoulders loosened, not with relief, but with surrender. My lungs released air I hadn't realized I was holding. My hands stopped searching for something to do. My sentence didn't disappear. It just sank deeper, where it would be harder to reach the next time. After that, everything became simpler in the worst way. The world didn't demand my voice anymore. It only demanded that I stay still, that I watch, that I do what was in front of me, that I keep my expression neutral when my mind was anything but. I learned how quickly a person can adjust to their own silence, how fast it starts to feel like the natural order of things, and by the time anyone looked in my direction again, I had already made my choice. I said nothing. By the time I understood the shape of the place I was in, it had already shaped me. It was an old kind of order, built on repetition and proximity. Men living too close together, working too close together, hearing the same voices until those voices sounded like weather. You stopped asking why the sky was gray. You only learned to read it, to anticipate what it would do next, and to keep your head down when it darkened. Everything was arranged in layers. Not just the paperwork, not just the equipment, but the people. Some stood where they could decide. Some stood where they could advise. Most stood where they could only carry out what was decided and pretend it had been their own thought all along. And if you lived long enough in that structure, you learned to confuse obedience with belonging. I had been around it long enough to recognize its moods. There were days when it felt almost ordinary, voices low, movements practiced, routines doing what routines are supposed to do, keeping fear from spilling into the open. Then there were days when the air changed, when small decisions started to stack, when the pace quickened without anyone admitting it. On those days, conversations tightened. Jokes disappeared. Even the men who usually spoke freely began to measure their words as if each one had weight. The closer you were to authority, the more you could hear that tightening happen. It wasn't always loud. Most of the pressure lived in what didn't get said. A glance held half a second too long. Someone choosing to speak only after looking toward the same figure in the room, as if checking whether speech was allowed. The habit of waiting for the most senior voice before anyone else allowed their own opinion to exist. I learned early that there were two kinds of silence. The first was the silence of uncertainty, when no one knew what to do and everyone was afraid to admit it. The second was worse, the silence of certainty when everyone knew what would be done and the only question left was who would be blamed if it went wrong. I was never the person the room waited for. I was close enough to see how decisions were made, close enough to know they weren't always clean or confident, but not close enough to interrupt the process without becoming part of the story. And that was the hidden rule. If you spoke at the wrong time, you didn't just offer an opinion, you offered yourself. You became a problem that had to be handled, a voice that had to be corrected, a crack in the surface that could spread. It wasn't that people were cruel as a habit. It was that the system punished friction. It rewarded smoothness, speed, and certainty, whether that certainty was earned or performed. A person who hesitated was a person who made others hesitate, and hesitation was contagious. Better to silence one uncertain voice than risk a room full of doubt. So men learned to file their concerns away under safer language. Instead of saying, "This is wrong," they said, "It might be difficult." Instead of saying, "This will fail," they said, "There are risks." Instead of saying, "We should stop," they said, "We should consider." The words became softer not because the dangers became smaller, but because softness was the price of being allowed to speak at all. Even then, speaking carried a cost. You could feel it in the way people watched one another after a question was asked. Not openly, never openly, but with that careful attention that pretends to be casual. A man who asked too much was remembered, not in a dramatic way, in a quiet way that mattered more. His name attached itself to a certain kind of trouble, not disloyalty, not rebellion, just inconvenience. And in places like that, inconvenience could be fatal to a career, to trust, sometimes to the simple comfort of being left alone. I watched it happen more than once. Someone would raise a point politely, even timidly. They'd frame it as concern for the mission, for the men, for efficiency, and the room would change temperature, not because the point was offensive, but because it introduced a choice. It forced the people higher up to either acknowledge uncertainty or crush it. And there was always someone eager to crush it, not with anger, but with a calm dismissal that made the speaker feel childish for having brought it up. Sometimes the response was a smile. Sometimes it was a joke at the speaker's expense. Sometimes it was nothing at all, just a pause, long enough for the speaker to feel the weight of being the only voice in the room that had disturbed the surface. After that, the speaker usually didn't try again. I told myself I was observing, learning, keeping my head down until I understood the boundaries. That was my excuse. But the truth was simpler. I learned the lesson the place was designed to teach. I learned that survival wasn't only about what you could endure physically. It was about what you could endure in your own mind while still appearing useful. The routines helped with that. Routine makes everything feel less like a choice. There were schedules, checklists, repeated procedures that gave the illusion of control. The same movements, the same phrases, the same patterns of waiting and rushing. Men would complain about the monotony and then cling to it the moment things started to shift, because monotony was familiar, and familiar felt safe. Authority lived in small gestures, a hand placed on a map, a pencil tapping once, twice as if to summon agreement, a chair angled so a man could see the entire room without turning his head, voices that never rose, because they didn't have to. A man didn't need to shout to be obeyed when everyone in the room had already decided that his words would become reality. And the ones who carried those words down the line, the messengers, the intermediaries, the men whose job was to translate intention into action, learned to speak in a certain way. They didn't argue. They didn't explain. They delivered. If they had doubts, they stored them behind their eyes, where no one could challenge them. When orders traveled, they changed shape. By the time they reached the bottom, they no longer sounded like decisions. They sounded like facts. That was the most dangerous part. If something is a decision, it can be questioned. If something is treated as a fact, questioning it makes you look foolish, or worse, deliberate. It makes you seem like someone trying to undo what is already set. So you learn to treat even the most fragile plans like stone. I wasn't naive. I knew mistakes happened. Everyone knew. But the culture wasn't built to admit that in advance. Mistakes were only allowed to exist in the past, after they had already taken their toll. Before that, doubt was treated as weakness. Fear was treated as contamination. Responsibility was something you performed, not something you carried. There were moments when I saw that performance up close. Men who could not afford to appear uncertain would speak with a kind of practiced firmness, even when their eyes betrayed them. Men who privately worried would publicly sound convinced. You could hear it in how they ended their sentences. No upward inflection. No space left open for disagreement. They didn't invite discussion. They concluded, and everyone beneath them learned to mirror that tone, because mirroring was safer than honesty. The distance between what a man thought and what he said became a normal gap. In that gap, my own silence grew comfortable. Not pleasant, not proud. Comfortable in the way a splint is comfortable. Restricting, awkward, but familiar. I could feel how it protected me. Silence didn't draw attention. Silence didn't create enemies. Silence didn't invite questions about loyalty or courage. And yet, I was close enough to hear the warning forming. It wasn't written in bold on any paper. It didn't arrive with a siren. It came the way most disasters begin, as a detail that didn't fit. A small inconsistency. A tone in someone's voice that was too confident, too quick. A minor adjustment that was treated like nothing, even though it shifted everything. I noticed it. I noticed it early enough that it could have mattered, but noticing is not the same as speaking. Not in a place where every word has a price and every pause is watched. I felt the boundary inside myself, the line between what I was allowed to know and what I was allowed to say, and I understood, with a clarity that made me sick, that the place didn't need to gag me. It only needed me to remember my position, so I stayed where I belonged. I did what I was supposed to do. I listened. I watched. I swallowed what rose in my throat, and I let the day continue as if nothing was wrong, because in that world, the easiest way to survive was to act like certainty had already been decided for you. The argument began quietly, the way these things always do, not between people, but inside me. At first it sounded reasonable, calm, almost responsible. A voice that knew the rules of the place and spoke in their language. It reminded me of everything I didn't know, everything I couldn't prove. It told me that intuition was not evidence, that discomfort was not the same as danger. It asked me who I thought I was, weighing possibilities against men who had been doing this longer than I had been alive. That voice was persuasive because it didn't sound like fear. It sounded like discipline. It said, "You're tired. You're reading too much into it." It said, "This isn't your role." It said, if there were a real problem, someone higher up would have seen it already. I wanted to believe it. I leaned on it the way you lean on a railing you hope is solid. But there was another voice, harder to ignore the longer I stayed quiet. It didn't speak in complete sentences. It didn't offer explanations. It surfaced as images instead. Small, sharp impressions that refused to smooth themselves out. A step taken too quickly. A calculation done too cleanly. A confidence that felt rehearsed rather than earned. It was the voice that noticed what didn't line up. I would catch myself replaying moments that had already passed, as if reviewing them might change their outcome. A phrase someone used that closed a conversation too neatly. A nod that came too fast. A pause that should have been longer. I started seeing patterns where I hadn't meant to look for them, and once I saw them, I couldn't unsee them. That was when the real debate began. Because the fear wasn't just about punishment or humiliation, it was about identity, about what kind of person I was allowed to be in that environment. Speaking up would not just challenge a decision, it would redefine me in the eyes of everyone who mattered. I would become the one who questioned, the one who complicated things, the one who introduced uncertainty into a system that survived by pretending it had none. I imagined the moment over and over. I imagined myself clearing my throat, the room quieting just enough for my voice to sound louder than I wanted. I imagined the heads turning, some curious, some irritated. I imagined the words leaving my mouth imperfectly, because they always do, and being seized upon not for what they meant, but for how they were phrased. I imagined someone responding before I could finish, gently correcting me, reframing my concern into something smaller, safer. I imagined the relief in the room when my interruption was neutralized, and I imagined the look that would linger afterward, the subtle shift that would mark me as someone to watch. In some versions, nothing dramatic happened. No anger, no confrontation, just a quiet acknowledgement followed by a decision to proceed anyway. And in those versions, my fear felt almost foolish. I would have risked everything just to be ignored. That possibility terrified me more than outright punishment. Because if I spoke and nothing changed, then my voice would be on record, and so would the outcome. The failure would no longer belong only to the decision-makers. A piece of it would belong to me too. I would have seen it coming, named it, and still been powerless to stop it. Silence at least preserved the illusion that I had been spared responsibility. That was another lie I told myself. That silence was neutral. I thought about timing, about how speaking too early made you look alarmist, and speaking too late made you look opportunistic. I tried to find the perfect moment, one where concern would sound reasonable rather than disruptive. But the more I waited, the fewer openings there seemed to be. Conversations closed faster. Decisions hardened. What had once been discussed became assumed. Each time I didn't speak, it became harder to justify speaking the next time. The sentence that lived behind my teeth began to rot there. It lost its clean edges. It picked up qualifiers and excuses. Instead of a clear warning, it became a tangled explanation I wasn't sure anyone would have the patience to hear. I rehearsed it anyway, silently, adjusting it to fit different imagined audiences. Shorter for one person, softer for another, always safer than it should have been. Sometimes I almost convinced myself it was no longer necessary. There were moments when doubt retreated, when routine smothered it, when the machinery of the place did what machinery does, moved forward, loudly enough to drown out thought. During those moments, silence felt justified. It felt earned. I told myself that vigilance did not require speech, that watching carefully was its own form of responsibility. But the doubt always returned, usually at night when there was nothing to distract me from it, when the sounds of the place changed and my mind filled the gaps. I would lie awake and feel the sentence rise again, heavier now, less polite. It no longer asked questions, it made statements. It insisted. That was when fear took on a different shape. It wasn't the fear of consequences anymore. It was the fear of discovering what kind of man I was if I continued to say nothing. I wondered how many times a person could choose silence before it stopped being a choice at all. How many times you could tell yourself next time before next time lost its meaning. I watched others closely, looking for signs of the same struggle. I wanted confirmation that I wasn't alone in seeing the problem. But if anyone else noticed, they hid it well. Faces remained neutral. Voices remained steady. No one gave me the permission I was secretly seeking, and I realized something that unsettled me more than the danger itself. The system didn't require unanimous belief. It only required unanimous behavior. As long as everyone acted as if the plan was sound, it might as well have been. Doubt unexpressed had no power. It evaporated the moment it stayed inside. I began to feel split. Outwardly, I functioned. I followed instructions. I responded when spoken to. I made myself useful. Inwardly, I carried a constant tension, like a wire pulled too tight. Every new detail was filtered through the same question. Is this the moment? And every time the answer was no, the wire tightened a little more. I started resenting the people above me, not for their authority, but for how little they seemed to hesitate. Their confidence felt offensive, not because it was false, but because it was contagious. The more certain they appeared, the more unreasonable my doubts felt by comparison. I told myself that courage wasn't reckless, that a measured person knew when to stay quiet, that history was full of people who panicked too soon and caused unnecessary damage. I told myself that restraint was a virtue, but restraint began to feel indistinguishable from cowardice. The final rationalization was the most seductive of all, that speaking wouldn't change anything anyway, that the machine was already moving too fast, that a single voice, my voice, would only create noise, not change direction, that staying silent spared everyone the discomfort of a pointless interruption. That was when I understood how easily a person can betray their own conscience without ever feeling dramatic about it. I didn't feel like a villain. I didn't feel brave. I felt practical, sensible, small, and with each quiet moment that passed, the silence stopped feeling temporary. It started to feel permanent, like something I was building rather than avoiding. I still hadn't decided, but I was beginning to understand how the decision would be made for me if I waited long enough. The moment arrived without ceremony. No signal, no pause for reflection. Just a shift in tone, a subtle tightening of voices, and suddenly what had been discussed became what would be done. The transition was so smooth it almost felt natural, like a thought completing itself. I was there when it happened, close enough to hear the words clearly, close enough to recognize the flaw the instant it was framed as certainty. The decision wasn't announced as a decision. It was spoken as if it had always existed, waiting only to be acknowledged. A few sentences delivered evenly, no emphasis, no hesitation, the kind of language that closes doors without ever mentioning that doors are closing. My body reacted before my mind caught up. There was a brief heat in my chest, sharp and urgent. My breath shortened. I felt my jaw tighten, my tongue press hard against the roof of my mouth as if it were bracing itself. The sentence I had carried for days surged forward all at once, fully formed, stripped of politeness. This was the moment it had been preparing for. I could feel the weight of it in my throat, dense and physical, like swallowing something that refused to go down. My lips parted slightly, not enough to speak, enough to remind me that I still could. The room was quiet in that specific way that follows authority, alert, expectant, obedient. No one moved, no one questioned. The air seemed to lean forward, waiting for execution, not discussion. I watched the faces around me. Some were blank, trained. Some showed relief, as if having a direction, any direction, was preferable to uncertainty. A few betrayed something closer to unease, but none of them spoke. Not one. I remember thinking that silence was spreading faster than sound ever could. The decision settled into place, and with it came the understanding that this was the last opening. Not because time was running out, but because once an order takes shape, challenging it no longer sounds like caution. It sounds like defiance. I imagined my voice breaking the stillness. I imagined how loud it would seem, how out of proportion, how it would pull every eye toward me, not as a colleague, not as a participant, but as an interruption. I imagined the pause that would follow, too long to pretend nothing had happened, too short for anything to truly change. I imagined someone responding calmly, firmly, dismantling my concern piece by piece, not angrily. Anger would have justified resistance. Calm dismissal would erase me more thoroughly. And beneath all of that imagination was a simpler fear, quieter and more honest. I did not want to be the only one standing when everyone else remained seated. My heart pounded hard enough that I worried it might betray me. My hands curled slightly, fingers pressing into my palms, grounding me in the physical fact of my body, as if to keep me from moving on instinct alone. The words came right up to the edge. I could taste them. Metallic. Wrong. Speaking them would have felt like tearing something loose, like stepping out of line and discovering too late that there was no way back in. For a fraction of a second, I told myself that this hesitation, this final pause, was responsible. That rushing to speak now would be impulsive, emotional. That if there were truly a problem, it could be addressed later, through proper channels, with calmer voices and more time. That thought was thin, and I knew it, because there would be no later. Not like this. The decision moved from language into action with alarming speed. Men shifted, papers were gathered. The energy in the room changed from deliberation to preparation. Momentum took hold, and momentum does not stop to listen. I felt the sentence sink back down inside me, heavier than before. It didn't disappear. It lodged itself somewhere deeper, somewhere that ached. My throat loosened, not with relief, but with resignation. My breath steadied, automatically, traitorously. My body adjusted to the choice before my mind fully accepted it. No one looked at me. That, more than anything, sealed it. The absence of attention felt like permission, like absolution. The world continued as if my silence had been the correct response all along. I stood there, outwardly indistinguishable from everyone else. Another figure absorbing orders, another presence nodding along with inevitability. From the outside, there was nothing to mark the moment as significant, but inside, something shut. I felt it close with a dull finality, like a latch catching. The possibility of speech didn't vanish. It simply became irrelevant. The time for words had passed, and the silence I had practiced for so long finally claimed its reward. I did not raise my voice. I did not interrupt. I let the decision stand unchallenged, and in doing so, I felt the last fragile thread of resistance go slack inside me. The warning died where it had always lived, unspoken. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They came the way damage often does, quietly at first, wrapped in normality. The plan unfolded as if nothing were wrong, as if certainty alone could carry it forward. There were movements, preparations, the familiar rhythms of work resuming. From a distance it might have looked orderly, efficient, almost reassuring. Up close, it felt wrong. I recognized the signs immediately, not because I was skilled, but because they were the very signs I had been afraid of. Small deviations, minor delays explained away too quickly. Adjustments that were framed as routine but carried a strain beneath them, like a structure compensating for a crack no one wanted to acknowledge. I watched carefully, too carefully. Every new detail seemed to confirm what I had sensed before. Not dramatically, not in a way that invited alarm, just enough to tighten something in my chest each time. A quiet recognition that grew harder to deny. The machine was still moving, but it was no longer smooth. It shuddered in places it wasn't supposed to. No one spoke about it directly. That was the cruelest part. The language remained confident, even as reality began to fray around it. Reports were delivered with the same tone as always. Explanations arrived quickly, pre-packaged, ready to soothe anyone who might feel unsettled. The story was always that this was expected, manageable, temporary. I wanted to believe it. I told myself that setbacks were normal, that every operation, every plan encountered friction, that my earlier doubts were exaggerating what was now just an inconvenient phase. I repeated these thoughts until they sounded almost convincing, until they dulled the edge of my fear just enough for me to function. But the confirmations kept coming, not as announcements, not as alarms, but as absences. Something that should have happened didn't. A response that should have arrived never did. Time stretched in ways that made no sense if everything was truly under control. And in those stretches, my mind filled the gaps with the sentence I had buried. I saw this coming. The realization didn't bring satisfaction. It brought nausea, because with every confirmation my silence grew louder. It pressed against me from the inside, accusing without words. I found myself remembering the exact moment I could have spoken, replaying it with painful clarity, the angle of the room, the sound of my own breathing, the way the decision had settled into place as if it had always belonged there. I began to notice changes in the people around me. Not panic, not chaos, just small shifts, tighter faces, quieter conversations, eyes that lingered on details they would have ignored before. Men who had once spoken easily now chose their words with care. as if language itself had become unstable. No one said, "This is wrong." They said things like, "We'll know more soon." They said, "There's been a delay." They said, "We're adjusting." Each phrase felt like a step backward from the truth. As the situation deteriorated, authority did what it always does under pressure. It narrowed. Fewer voices were invited to speak. Decisions were made faster, with less discussion, not because confidence had increased, but because doubt had become dangerous. Admitting uncertainty now would mean admitting that earlier certainty had been false. I stayed where I was supposed to be. Outwardly, nothing had changed about me. I followed instructions, I performed my tasks, I nodded when others spoke. No one asked what I thought, and I made sure not to volunteer it. Silence had become not just my habit, but my shield. Inside, though, the cost was accumulating. Every confirmation of failure felt personal, even though no one accused me of anything, especially because no one accused me. There was no confrontation to brace against, no punishment to endure that might have balanced the scales. There was only the quiet knowledge that I had chosen safety over responsibility, and that choice was now echoing outward. I started to avoid certain thoughts. I avoided imagining specific outcomes. I avoided tracing the line between the decision and what was now unfolding. I avoided counting how many people were affected by a choice I had watched in silence. Numbers felt dangerous. Specifics felt unbearable. Instead, I focused on procedure, on doing exactly what was asked, on shrinking my world down to the next task, the next instruction, the next moment where I didn't have to think beyond what was directly in front of me. But even that wasn't enough to keep the realization at bay. There were moments, brief, unguarded moments, when someone would say too much. A comment dropped carelessly, a sigh held too long, an admission framed as frustration rather than fear. In those moments, I could hear the same unease I had felt earlier, now shared, now undeniable, and still no one said what mattered. The silence had spread. It was no longer just mine. It had become part of the environment, thick and oppressive, a collective decision not to name the problem, because naming it would force someone to answer for it, and answering for it would mean looking backward, to the moment when it could have been prevented. I felt trapped by time. I knew that speaking now would not be the same as speaking before. Any warning I gave at this stage would sound like accusation, like self-preservation, like an attempt to distance myself from what was already happening. Even if my words were true, their timing would corrupt them. So, I said nothing. I watched the consequences solidify, step by step, into something undeniable. The fear I had once carried alone was now visible everywhere, though no one would admit its source. It lived in the way people avoided certain topics, in how conversations ended abruptly when they strayed too close to the truth. And through it all, the worst realization settled in with awful clarity. The damage was no longer theoretical. It was real, unfolding, irreversible, and my silence, once chosen to protect myself, had bound me to it completely. Time did not soften it. I once believed that distance would dull the edges, that memory would blur the details until the silence felt less deliberate. But time did the opposite. It stripped away everything unnecessary and left only what mattered, what I knew, when I knew it, and what I chose to do instead. I carry the moment with me, not as a scene, but as a sensation. It returns without warning, in the middle of ordinary days, in the pause before sleep, in the brief silence after someone asks a harmless question. My body remembers it even when my mind is elsewhere. The tightening in the chest, the reflex to hold my breath, the instinct to stay still. I don't relive what happened afterward as much as I relive what didn't happen before. The warning never given has a peculiar permanence. It doesn't age. It doesn't fade. It exists outside the flow of events, frozen at the instant when it still could have mattered. Everything that followed feels like consequence, but that moment feels like origin. I have tried to assign the blame elsewhere, to tell myself that the outcome would have been the same regardless of my words, that the machinery was too large, the decision too entrenched, the authority too distant. Sometimes I even believe that for a while. The mind is generous when it needs to survive, but belief does not erase memory, because memory knows what fear feels like, and it knows when fear is the reason something is left undone. It knows the difference between powerlessness and avoidance, and it knows how easily one can be disguised as the other. I don't speak about it, not because anyone has told me not to. There is no threat, no order, no risk left to calculate. The silence persists because it has become part of me. Speaking now would not undo anything. It would only expose the shape of my hesitation, preserved perfectly inside my own recollection. There are nights when I imagine the words again, not as they would have been spoken then, clumsy and urgent, but as they might sound now, measured, reflective, stripped of consequence. In those imaginings, the words feel almost harmless. But that is another trick of distance. Words only carry weight when they are spoken at the cost of something. Spoken now, they would be weightless. What haunts me is not the outcome itself, but the knowledge that I recognized it before it happened. I recognized it and chose to remain acceptable. That choice did not announce itself as cowardice. It arrived quietly, disguised as restraint, professionalism, realism. It asked nothing dramatic of me, only that I stay where I was, only that I let the moment pass, only that I trust others to carry a responsibility I knew, somewhere deep inside, belonged to anyone who saw the danger clearly, including me. I still remember the relief that followed my silence. Brief, shameful, the body's gratitude for avoiding exposure, for avoiding conflict. That relief did not last long, but its memory did. It reminds me how easily conscience can be negotiated when fear offers comfort in return. There is no redemption in this memory, no lesson neatly learned, no balance restored. The past remains fixed, indifferent to reflection. All that has changed is my awareness of what silence costs, not in theory, but in permanence. I have lived many years since then without being asked the question that mattered, and perhaps that is the final cruelty, that life continues, that days accumulate, that the world does not pause to mark the places where a voice should have been. But I know that there was a moment when the future was still fragile, still undecided, still listening, and I was there, close enough to touch it, close enough to interrupt it, close enough to matter, and I chose to stay quiet. That choice did not end when the moment passed. It stayed, it stays, and no amount of time has ever managed to make it silent.